35 names listed. This is pretty serious. Have we had anything as serious as this so far?
Well, yes, I think we've got something much more serious right now.
Well, I'm talking about up to the prior to this hearing.
May I answer that question, Mr.
Chairman?
I think we've got a much more serious situation now, and communist infiltration of the CIA.
Guest for this evening is the Honorable Joseph R. United States Senator from Wisconsin.
I will never avoid giving the facts to the American people, Mr. Huey. It's so easy, you see.
Mr. Nixon, what is the truth?
My fellow Americans, promise of the American Revolution and not the menace of the communist revolution.
Well, the truth is that we must continue to have peace. And we can if we continue to show firmness and strength to the communist world.
Ever notice what happens to Nixon when the political winds blow?
I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. That because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress.
Bush and Dukakis, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton.
Elect Tennessee's Al Gore.
Good evening. We are all reminded on a daily basis of the importance of each and every vote. Our very freedom came under attack. We're in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
Hello, Chicago! I don't need the rhetoric. I want a job. Obama is going to be out playing golf. I will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. I tell you that.
Well, my general description of politics today is that it's in a very bad way. There's a lot of hostility. There's a lot of polarization, ideological extremism. There's a lot of mistrust. I think we do tend to forget all of those dysfunctions are in some sense precedented. American politics has often been very rough going back to the founding. There was a lot of invective, there was a lot of stirring of outrage, a lot of mobilization of fear. To a certain extent, this is par for the course in American politics. There's a lot of violence in American history. So just because it's precedented doesn't mean that it ends well. That a lot of very bad things could happen, and are happening, quite frankly. I'm Ken Kirsch. I teach political science at Boston College. My work focuses on American politics, but more specifically on American constitutional development, American political development, American political thought. It's traditional, or was traditional in political science, to talk about the parties as if they were advocates of particular policies, and the voters chose the party based on what policies they wanted. I mean, this is part of the argument. Thomas Frank made it about what's the matter with Kansas. It was not in Kansas' interest to vote for conservative Republicans. And so what's the matter with them? Why are they acting irrationally? I think the presumption there is that people vote based on on particular policies, and that there's an objective answer as to which policies are going to benefit them versus not. I'm not sure how much that was ever true. It seems to have sort of economic presumptions to it, and there are other parts of politics. I mean, people say that now, that people are voting based on their animus rather than their interests. And I think current studies in political science have seemed to confirm that. In fact, political scientists have even come up with terms for this. Affective partisanship, which means essentially people are voting their emotions, and their emotions are often rage and hostility. There's developed a very strong literature on affective partisanship. A part of that literature, it's not only affective, but it's aversive partisanship, which means that it's based less on what you want than on who you hate, who you have an aversion for, who you consider an enemy. And I think the literature has confirmed that. We are in an extreme period of it. And I think the surveys are sometimes shocking, the degree to which people are motivated in politics by those dynamics. You know, in political thought, most famously with the German political philosopher Carl Schmitt, he said all politics is about friend-enemy distinctions. Another way of putting this is that we're in a time of identity politics. Most people talk about that as if it's a phenomenon of the left, that identity politics is wraparound now on all sides. And conservative critics of the left used to say that identity politics is a recipe for hostility and balkanization. They don't seem to have pushed against it. They just seem to have doubled down on their own identity. And so they've just joined the fray. I think the dynamics with political parties have been inverted. In the past, the parties were run mostly by mainstream elites, and so the party was the voice of responsibility. To the extent that there was extremism, the party would kind of push against it. I think what's happened, you know, in the past quarter century at least, if not a little more, is that the power dynamic between the party elites and the populist has been inverted. I think what happens now is that it's the people, you know, from the grassroots who are an insurgency which dictate the direction of the party and what the party does. I will say that there's an asymmetry here. I think this is much more the case with the Republican Party. But on the other hand, it's a problem for the Democrats because the Democratic elite is out of touch. I think the Republican Party is quite in touch, but in a very disturbing way. This is a case of being careful of what you wish for, because now there is no filter, there is no tamping down. But look, these elites were committed to institutions. And I mean, Watergate's a classic example, right? I mean, Watergate was a huge scandal. I mean, I think we've had like 50 Watergates in the past few years, and we can't even remember them all. I think the things that have happened in the Trump administration, whether dealing with the 2 different impeachments at least, were much worse, much more dangerous. January 6th was one of the worst things, maybe the worst thing that happened constitutionally in the country's history. But no one talks about it that way, or very few people do. I mean, compared to the Civil War, Calhoun and the Southerners had a plausible argument. It was a nation of states, and sovereign states was not actually a fringe argument. you would block a peaceful transfer of power between one president and the winning candidate is unprecedented. But in Watergate, for example, I mean, once the evidence came out, the party leaders and including in Congress, the Republican Party leaders said, we won't accept this. This is not appropriate for a president of the United States. You know, obviously that is not the dynamic right now. So as far as the news cycle, yes, I mean, it's horrible. It is not healthy for a democracy. I remember when I was young, the era of 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, you know? And the news was straight up the middle with some old, very sophisticated looking white guy telling us how it was and being very careful. Well, it may have had a liberal bias. It was definitely center liberal. It was establishment. There were no other options. I mean, the other options were you could subscribe to a magazine, or if you were a real extremist and conspiracy theorist, you'd have to write away to some P.O. box in southern Mississippi. I think all the forces are pulling towards polarization. And look, I think the incentives, some of them are personal, but some of them are economic. For when you talk about media, that there's always going to be a niche for someone to attract attention by being especially good at bomb throwing. That it works. Look, I mean, there's been a radical democratization of voice. And when you combine that with the profit motive and basic human psychology and basic human passions, it's a very combustible mixture. In the past, candidates or people with aspiration to higher office had to come up through the ranks and impress the party elites and get the funding from the party elites. Now there's a way around that, a very easy way around that, which is to seize national attention. They can also tap into very large donors, and very often they're in not competitive districts. Take someone who's like Sarah Palin. In the old Republican Party, I don't think you would go from being mayor of Wasilla, Alaska, to being the vice presidential candidate. She was viewed as sparky and outspoken. She seized national attention with a speech and then built on that. Look at Donald Trump. Not only did he have no political experience, he had no evidence of any sort of civic commitment. He was a reality TV star. Talk about quick news cycles. But that's not the traditional route, and I remember a lot of discussion early on in his campaign that assumed the old model, where all of these people had worked their way up through the party. They had started out on the town council, they moved to the state's attorney, and then the state legislature, and the governor's office. That entire ecosystem has been short-circuited. Look, again, there are precedents in American history, but the technology and the ecosystem of the media does matter. And obviously, there's something different that began in the early 20th century, and then again, something different in the early 1990s. Scapegoating is an old tactic, and it particularly works in popular politics. You can be very successful by blaming people for ills, especially in a context in which the causes are impersonal, structural, complicated. People need a relatively simple message. And affixing blame for something, particularly if it's a vulnerable group that people are susceptible to being suspicious of anyway, that it's a great shorthand for all sorts of fears and grievances and resentments that can be very much mobilized. Obviously, the successes of that sort of politics are strongest when people are suffering in some way and have a need to lift the blame off their own shoulders for their own predicament. And so politicians are very quick to jump on that. In contemporary politics, for example, It's really kind of astounding to see people like Ron DeSantis in Florida or J.D. Vance in Ohio. They're particularly interesting because they started out not doing this. But once they saw the way the landscape was, probably Josh Hawley too in Missouri, they had no hesitation about, or Ted Cruz in Texas, about suddenly switching and doing this really base, crude, unsophisticated, vulgar politics. Those four have not hesitated to adopt that as soon as it became useful. Look, the Southern strategy, that was a party-building exercise. I mean, that was the end of the old order. Increasingly, in the era of the Civil Rights Movement, the Southern Democrats, white Southern Democrats, were allied with the liberal New Deal Democrats. I mean, they were New Deal Democrats. They supported Franklin Roosevelt. And obviously the Southern strategy was, Nixon and his aides sensing an opportunity to break them off from the Democratic Party and bring them into the Republican Party. Look, in a sense, the opportunity was there since the 30s, but I think the situation, the economic situation, the cultural situation of the late 60s and the early 1970s presented a new opportunity where a sort of more identity-based message was more likely to work.
Is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me. All right, I won't do it. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes. And all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
It wasn't just that the Republican Party was always racist. The Republican Party, it was the Democratic Party that was the racist party. And in fact, if I remember correctly, Nixon was a dues-paying member of the NAACP earlier in his career when he was in the Eisenhower administration. That he was at least a civil rights moderate. He wanted to be president. And the Nixon, who was vice president in the early Eisenhower administration, was not 1968. And he saw what he could do and was willing to do it. I think sometimes people exaggerate. Like I see the racial resentment as part of a cluster of identity-based issues, and they reinforced each other. There was a concern with crime, there was a concern with anti-Americanism, and I think Nixon and his aides saw an opportunity to take it in a new direction, and they did that. And that is definitely the beginning of the current Republican Party. I think it's incumbent upon every citizen who cares about the country, genuinely cares about the country, to develop media literacy, including social media literacy, to understand what algorithms are, to understand the extent to which you are being manipulated and directed in certain directions that are not healthy for the country, to have a sense of which your animosities are being stoked in a way that's not healthy for the country. I think if I could say anything, I would, implore people to develop an awareness for that, and maybe even against their instincts and maybe even against some of their pleasures, to take that responsibility of citizenship very seriously and to think critically about the media on the other side, but on your own side, and also to recognize that yes, the media is biased. There is such a thing as liberal media bias. There's such a thing as conservative media bias, that to a certain extent, even the most sophisticated people are reading biased sources. But the difference is that, real citizens who care about their country are going to not accept everything, even in their preferred sources, that they're going to recognize that they can extract very useful information from those sources, but that sometimes they're going to have to think critically about it and come up with their own opinions. And I think, if there's any hope for a better future for the country, it's going to be in people taking up that civic duty and I would say patriotic responsibility.